So for everyone that's joined us, how many have we got online there now, Ken?
Nearly 30.
Nearly 30, and I'm sure that's going to grow as the time goes on. We had 160 the last time we all met for this GDPR position paper, which we launched 2 weeks ago. And I want to say a special thanks to Denis Naughten, who's online. Deputy Denis Naughten. Are you still Deputy, Denis? For a little while? No, it's gone now.
No, the man formerly known as Deputy.
The man formerly known as Deputy. You have to get a symbol now. Helped us with this, along with many others in this room. And the issue for Ireland, I think if you're a candidate, you might understand it in these terms. You're a candidate for the general election and the party keep putting your name on the ticket, but you keep not getting elected, and eventually your name is pulled off the ticket. And I think that's what's happened in cancer trials in Ireland, because we keep pitching for clinical trials for this country. And because our startup timelines, that means the time from we get an agreement for a trial to when it's opened in a hospital is longer and longer. Some of them are going up to 2.5 years before we actually get the trial open. International companies are saying we're not going to go to Ireland. It's too slow. And for us in academia, where we're running trials from a not-for-profit perspective, we're looking at running clinical trials that really help the patients in the clinic today. So my colleagues here, Professor Seamus O'Reilly, who's our clinical lead, and our vice clinical lead, Professor Jerry Hanna, you know, they're looking at patients and they're saying, look, I have an idea that might work for this patient in front of me. I want to run a clinical trial, and to do that, there's a cost. And when you're trying to work with other international groups and European groups to bring those kinds of trial ideas into the clinic, which are really patient-led, that's what we do in Cancer Trials Ireland. That's really tricky to do in an environment where it takes longer, because all of you know, you only have to think about a massive big hospital that's being built at the moment. The longer things take, the more expensive they become. And it's the same with clinical trials. So how do we do what we do right now? We're part funded by the Irish Cancer Society, and Krista's here from the Irish Cancer Society today, and we're very grateful for that. We're partly funded by a health research board grant through the Department of Health. It funds about 20% of what we do in Cancer Trials Ireland, and it funds about 10% of what our hospital site staff do for cancer trials in the country. The rest of the funding is coming from both commercial investment for clinical trials and collaborative groups, those international groups that we talked about earlier. And in order to do more, so we hear the Minister for Health is talking about double, and I have to recognise that there has been a committee set up with the Department of Health. And I think it's about 3 times at this stage, because you sit on it, Seamus. And that committee is looking at the roadblocks that are there and are in place. And I know the target is to double the number of patients on clinical trials. But to do that, you have to double the investment, at least double the investment. And so there's 3 very clear calls. So we have an election manifesto. It's in front of everyone here today. And there's a nice little pledge to start for all the political parties to sign up to. And the 3 calls is to double the funding to the Health Research Board for our clinical trials infrastructure, to look at that shared island fund, because all island collaborations is very important. Our colleague here, Jerry, works in Belfast. We've a lot of colleagues who work in Belfast City Hospital and Derry. We try to run clinical trials on an all-island basis, and we have a shared island fund. Why aren't we using that to develop infrastructure for clinical trials in Irish hospitals? And we want to cut through that red tape. That is no cost, by the way, 0 cost to cut through red tape, and we'll hear more about that later. But I think the most important position to get this morning is from the person who is dealing with the issue every day, and that is the patient. And you all might sit there and go, yeah, it's very important to hear. We are all patients, and if you're not a patient now, you will be. And at least 1 in 2 people in this country are going to have cancer within the next 20 years. And that's people in this room, half the people in this room, half the people online. That's the reality. And believe me, when you're sitting in the clinic and you're diagnosed with cancer, it is a very scary place. You don't want to be talking about it at a forum like this, by the way. This is a very brave thing to do. And very often when a clinician is looking at you and they're thinking, I don't have anything new here. That's the sweet spot. That's the place where we want to be able to say, I have a clinical trial, and this might give you some time. This might cure you. And so on that note, I'm going to ask Seamus Cotter, who's joining us from the west all the way from Galway, well, all the way from Clare. He's been talking from his experience in Galway Hospital. So Seamus.
Okay, thanks very much, Eibhlin. And thanks for having me on the call today. So I'll briefly give you an outline of my story because in 2016, I was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. And at that time, my clinician gave me about 18 months to survive or go on a clinical trial. So it was a case of go on standard of care, which would have a limited lifespan, give me a limited lifespan, or go on a clinical trial, which would give me some hope and possibly lead to survival, which it's obviously worked very well because I'm still here. But I was lucky because I live in Ennis in County Clare, or very near to Ennis in County Clare. And generally I'm in the western region, or the Midwestern region. And a lot of people from Ennis would go to Limerick. I wouldn't have got on the same clinical trial if I was in Limerick. And unfortunately, that would have meant my family would have lost me. And you know, it's unfortunate that clinical trials aren't available everywhere and to everyone who needs them. There is certainly a geographical disparity between what's going on in the west of Ireland and what's available in the east, in terms of the number of clinical trials and the number of patients who are able to get on them. One thing I want to highlight is the fact, I'm not sure if everybody's aware of this, but there was a significant administrative issue that happened in the Galway hospital around the 2019, 2020, I think it was, which meant that recruitment on clinical trials stopped for approximately 2 years. As a result of that, people died. I think I would guess quite a number of people died, you know, and I think that is partly down to the red tape and over administration that we applied to clinical trials. And you know, I think a common sense approach needs to be taken. And you know, thanks to Cancer Trials Ireland, they're taking a lead on trying to have this talked about, have it dealt with. And yeah, I'll leave it there, Eibhlin. Thanks.
Thank you. And we might come back to you, Seamus, and really, really important to highlight. I think it's stark when you hear that, you know, if I'd gone to Limerick, I would have died. Because Galway were in a position to open a clinical trial. That's exactly the point we're trying to make today. This is not a nice thing to have. When you have cancer trials are part of the care pathway for many patients. So on that note, Miriam Staunton is also a member of our Patient Consultants Committee at Cancer Trials Ireland.
Thanks, Eibhlin. Yeah, so just to follow on from Seamus, I guess a little bit about me. So I was diagnosed with stage 3 melanoma in 2018, and at that point in time, I was not eligible to get systemic treatment because it wasn't reimbursed in this country. It was reimbursed elsewhere. And I had to wait until I progressed to stage 4 to access the treatment, which, you know, I hear Seamus use the term, so lucky I went to Galway, you know, lucky to have stage 4 cancer. Luckily, then when I progressed to stage 4, I was able to access the treatments, which worked for me. And they work for about 50% of people with melanoma at stage 4. However, the other 50% currently have no treatments that are available to them. And that's, I guess, what drove my advocacy is seeing the unfairness of that, where we have unmet medical need and we're not servicing that need. So I'm part of the 98.5% of cancer patients who don't access clinical trial, and that's what's driven my advocacy. I think it's so important. You know, we're talking about a very little cost to the state to bring these trials in just through cutting red tape, and a lot of the funding comes from the pharma companies themselves. It's a massive cost to the patient, the current delays. So because we're slow to start up and there's a lot of bureaucracy, we don't attract trials. That means patients here don't get access to trials. We cannot travel for trials in general unless they're fully self-funded. So if we don't bring them here, patients just die, and that's what's happening. That's what's happening currently. 50% of stage 4 melanoma patients will just die, and there are trials with effective, or you know, what seems relatively quite effective treatments available that we can't access here. So that's really my pitch. Is, you know, there's no reason for us not to remove a lot of this bureaucracy. We're well set up in terms of our clinical setup, in terms of our proximity to pharma industry, and we don't leverage that. And it's just, to me, it boggles the mind that we tie ourselves up in knots. And you know, we don't see, obviously, because they're a vulnerable group, right? Patients that die don't have a voice. I guess plead that, can we please do something to help improve the efficacy of the system to allow more treatments to patients who need it.
Thank you, Miriam, and thank you so much for being here today. I think both Miriam and Seamus are telling a very personal story, and I've been in my own, you know, journey myself over the last year, and it's not an easy story to tell. So, but you're doing it for others, and fighting the good fight for others, and hopefully we will help everyone involved in Cancer Trials Ireland over time get this message across. And you might sit there as politicians and go, you know, Ireland's a small country, there's so much we can do. We pitch above our weight in this country when it comes to science and when it comes to clinical trials and clinical infrastructure. And I'm going to ask Professor Seamus O'Reilly next to me to talk, but just bear that in mind. The clinical doctors who've come into Ireland they're all Irish, they've come home. And Jerry, Seamus, you worked in Washington, Jerry, you worked over in Australia, and Peter Max, and there are other clinicians who've worked in MD Anderson, John Hopkins, Memorial Sloan Kettering, all these big US teaching cancer hospitals, where 50% of the patients in those hospitals are put on clinical trials. You know, so and then they come home to Ireland and they come home with all of that expertise and all of that desire to bring trials into the clinic. And that's where a lot of this passion is coming from in our organisation. The members of Cancer Trials Ireland are made up of Seamus and his colleagues and researchers. So Seamus.
So thanks very much for coming in today. I've been a medical oncologist in Ireland since 1998. I think that sometimes there's a perception that cancer research and clinical trials is a bit like the cream on the top of a pint of Guinness. It looks great, but it's not really substantive. And I guess I'm conscious as politicians, you're dealing with pressures of waiting lists and key performance indicators. But when you pour a pint of Guinness, the predominant colour is not the black, cream. That's because cancer research makes cancer care. Studies have consistently shown that if you're cared for in a hospital where research is done, your outcome is better. We have living evidence of this today, indisputable evidence. In my career, I've seen a dramatic decline in suffering in our communities, and cancer survivors being cured of really extensive cancer to go on and have families and raise families. But also, most importantly, the perception of cancer as a lost cause, which is what it was when I was a medical student, has been utterly changed. Now it's front and centre, and there's significant hope for our patients. I've also seen what government action can do. I was appointed in the year of the Good Friday Agreement. A wise oncologist who worked in Belfast and had trained in the National Cancer Institute made cancer research part of the Good Friday Agreement. So the clinical trials units that Seamus was looked after in Galway, and the ones that I set up in Waterford and Cork, they were part of the Good Friday Agreement. And that was a game changer for all of us. We really need similar engagement now. Since the Good Friday Agreement, the cancer registry data shows that the incidence of cancer has doubled in Ireland. in all communities. The other issue is that cancer research provides new possibilities and new options for patients, as Seamus has discussed and outlined. And these they're not quality of life transforming, they're life transforming. They're the person that's there for the graduation, they're the person that's there for the communion, they're the person that's there to see their grandchildren. That didn't happen when I was growing up. And we need government action now to help allow patients access to all the cancer research that's occurring, so we can continue to provide hope to future generations. Government action is needed as Eibhlin has talked about the bureaucracy. Government action is needed to cut through the undergrowth of bureaucracy, which means that we're bottom of the league in terms of time to study opening. Companies see that, and Martin Luther King said, "I don't worry about the anger of my enemies, I worry about the silence of my friends." And the problem is that our bureaucracy is translating to the silence of companies in coming here. We're off their essential list. We're off their go to country, even though our intellectual capital, our training capital is enormous. I mean, if you are an Irish healthcare professional, you can get a job anywhere in the world. So we are an incubator for training healthcare professionals globally. It is an added asset to say that you're an Irish healthcare professional, because of the legacy that has occurred from the training that we receive here and the legacy of other people that have emigrated. The bureaucracy that we see is disproportionately affecting patients outside of Dublin who need to travel for access to innovation. Again, we have the silence of our friends, because studies aren't opening there because it takes longer. We need protected, dedicated funding so our staff see that they have a future and not are relying on one 5-year grant cycle to another, where we're not really sure what's happening next. Our grant is due for renewal at the end of next year, beginning of 2026, but we're not sure what the landscape is. That uncertainty doesn't help. It doesn't help the new people starting, our research nurses, who are our biggest resource, or our radiation therapists, who are research-based as well. They're trying to get a mortgage. The housing crisis is the biggest issue for year in the election this year, according to all of the papers this weekend. But you can't pay a mortgage if you don't have a permanent job, and so you don't see a future. And if we don't have that structure and that security in our healthcare system, we're also saying that cancer research is the cream on the top of the pint. It's a little added extra that we would have rather than integral to it. That sends a message. There's all these messaging that occurs because we don't structure things to say, you have a permanent pensionable job, and we want you to drive cancer care in our communities. As Eibhlin has already said, 1 in 2 people in this room or online will get cancer in their lifetimes. And the data shows that if you are looked after and that access to cancer care trials is essential, it's not a luxury or added extra when everything else is done. And it's also why our neighbouring countries such as France, Spain and the United Kingdom have prioritised at government level with funding and legislative government action to reflect that ambition. We've talked about the National Clinical Trials Oversight Group that has been set up by the government, and is hugely welcome. I would hope that whatever government comes next will continue the ideas and the mandate and the energy that has brought. One of the documents that has been discussed in that is a royal decree in Spain, which has cut through the undergrowth of bureaucracy. So when we meet investigators from Spain or clinical trials organisations or our counterparts in Spain, and we tell them our issues, they say, well, we don't have that. But we're all working under the same EU legislation. We're handicapped. And I guess we need to go back to what the Good Friday Agreement did. It energised, it cut through the undergrowth, but also it provided structure, funding, and a future for our research enterprise. We need a Good Friday Agreement number 2 now as part of this election, and as a productive outcome from this election for all of our patients and all of our communities, and for everybody in fact in this room, because you might get cancer, but your loved one or your children or your parents will get it. So the knock-on effect, the ripple effect of this, of more funding, will be phenomenal.
Thank you, Seamus. I hope you got every word of that because I think it's valuable and the good. I mean, I was in college in Belfast during the Good Friday agreements, and I remember the two issues that were picked was human rights and cancer as an area to work together on this island. And one of the Professor Paddy Johnson was the clinician in Queen's who brought it about, and one of the things that came as a result was an agreement between us and the US National Cancer Institute. And it meant that Ireland becomes another site. So we can run our clinical trials, NCI sponsored clinical trials in Irish hospitals. That's phenomenal to be recognised. And it's phenomenal from a global point of view, not just from not just from a European point of view. And so there's such richness that can come from that. And you know, when you visit, and I know we've had some patients who've had to visit the National Cancer Institute in Washington to access clinical trials. And it's phenomenal when you go to one site and everything there is about a clinical trial, everything, every experience. So that's the dream for Ireland. Our next contribution is from a member of our board, very distinguished member of our board, Paul Egan, who has really taken the bull by the horns with us as a team, and we've looked at this issue of GDPR.
Thanks, Eibhlin. The privacy law, GDPR, has a purpose, but its purposes should not be to provide obstructions to having clinical trials here in Ireland. As Seamus said, the law in Spain should be the law in Ireland. And when we talk about GDPR, GDPR in fact consists of the following: a directly applicable European regulation, and we can do nothing about that. That's our law. But what we have here as well is we have a Data Protection Act of 2018, and then we have ministerial regulations made in 2018. Now, there was no obligation under GDPR for us to have these health research regulations, but we have them. And what it's done is it's created a culture, and we have a legal and administrative matrix which has people doing things that they don't need to do. For example, GDPR provides that information is able to be processed, to be used, to be shared, where there are compelling public reasons. Now, if 1 in 2 of the population are going to face cancer, it seems to me that that's a pretty compelling public interest. But even if you get into consents, what GDPR requires is that consent is given for a specific purpose. Well, it doesn't say it has to be a narrow, tiny, limited purpose. It can specify, I want my information used for medical research. I specify it. But what's happened instead is that there's, if you like, a prudery about this. That means that, no, it has to be smaller than that. Specific doesn't mean what it actually says. So what you then have as a result of that are requirement for successive consents for the use of the same medical data. And as well as that, when somebody dies, the use of that, the medical data of the person who's died, gets tied up in succession law. Only 2 days ago, I sat down with a friend of mine whose wife tragically died a year ago. And when I mentioned to him, by the way, you know that your consent has to be got for the use of your late wife's, he was astounded. He says, well, why don't they just use it? I mean, it's there. It's there, and he certainly would consent if and whenever he's asked about it. But the other bit of duplication of work is the fact that if there is a clinical trial taking place, there should be a requirement for only one data protection impact assessment, what is known in the trade as a DPIA. But what's happening is that there are multiple DPIAs taking place with regard to the same clinical trial, and everybody looking over their shoulder at somebody else's work. Now, how do we fix it? It just takes a signature of a minister. The issue has been created by the health research regulations and the habits that have developed under them. So if a ministerial order has been able to be made to provide these obstructions, well, a ministerial signature can be provided. That will be removed.
Thanks very much. So we just need a ministerial signature in the next. Now, I'm conscious that, you know, there's always a question mark about protecting the public, and is it in the public? I think, Paul, you've articulated that really well. That in the public interest, I think health is in the public interest first. And I see the patient advocates are nodding.
Yeah,
so for those of you that have access to the website, look at our election manifesto. The results of the public survey that we did show.
I don't know who was talking there.
Sorry, I can hear someone online. You might want to go on mute. I know whose voice that was as well. I'll be having a laugh with you later. So 80% think trials are a good idea. So the public want this. And when you ask the public, are you willing to share your health information for the good of the public and for the good people in Ireland in particular? This country always wants to give back, whether it's donating. And you see that when you look at our pie chart, who funds Cancer Trials Ireland, 14% of the money to do our trials comes from public fundraising that we don't even organise. We're not even involved in. People give us money and say, we want you to run pancreatic cancer trials in memory of Pat Smullen, or we want you to do more clinical trials in breast cancer. And we have a breast cancer trial with one of the most interesting drug combinations right now because of fundraising from a philanthropy. So like the public in Ireland want access to trials and they want to share data. That is all. When you're a politician, you need to think about that. And for the public who are watching and online, we keep saying when this crew knock on your door, we need to be asking about research. We need to be asking for clinical trials. Housing is important from an employment point of view, but I'll tell you, when you're sick and when you're in hospital and you're complaining, there's no trials here. There's no options here. This is where we talk about it. It's right now, and that's why we're doing this manifesto. So what I'm going to do now is the three of us are going to move, and we're going to ask our lovely colleagues here from political world, and fair play to them for being here, not only on time, but they have been in the room since 9 o'clock. I know, Emer, you came in a little bit later, but and what we're going to do, you'll know, because in the order of how they speak is how they arrived into the room.
Dennis said.
Everyone like that.
But to help you along, right, I'm going to ask our old friend Denis Naughten, because he'll set a little bit of the scene. And I think it'll help the candidates as well, just to hear from Denis before you start. So Denis, if you want to just contribute first, and then we'll move to the hustings.
Thanks, Eibhlin. And I suppose it's a bit easier for me. I'm not banging on the doors. But look, I think there's a huge challenge here, but we're actually pushing an open door from the perspective that, you know, there's clear.
You've gone on mute, Denis.
No longer TD. Sorry about that. So I don't know what happened there, but look, we're pushing an open door in that there's already a commitment from government through the existing programme for government, through the existing cancer strategy, to move to a situation where we have 6% of patients on clinical trials. And the reason for that is there is an acknowledgement right across both the health service and the political system that clinical trials are part of the patient treatment pathway now. They're not seen as an additional add-on. They're seen very much as a critical part of this. And I think, you know, Seamus made the point earlier about the geographic discrimination that's there. And I think this is something that we do need to address to ensure that regardless of whether you live in Donegal or in Waterford or in Dublin, you have the same access to a clinical trial. And that was the whole objective behind the cancer strategy and centralising services, that there was equal access to care and there was an equal opportunity of survival. That isn't the case at the moment, and that's something that we have to overcome. The other thing is, and a lot of us would have personal experience of this, we've all been involved in GoFundMe campaigns or local fundraising where we're fundraising so that someone can travel to the United States so that they can access a clinical trial. And we see hundreds of thousands of euro being raised for that. And Eibhlin, you made the point there, you know, that some of that money then, if that person passes away, is put towards research here in Ireland. But wouldn't it be great if that money was actually used to invest in research and supporting clinicians here in Ireland, ensuring that it's not just one patient who travels to the United States to get access to this care, but that every patient that meets the criteria can access this care here in Ireland. And we shouldn't be in a situation where people are being forced to fundraise to access these clinical trials in other parts of the world. And the frustrating thing about it is that the clinical trials are taking place in Europe. If we look at the first 6 months of this year, there were 3,500 industry-sponsored clinical trials in Europe, but just 11 of those involved patients here in Ireland. And that's where the problem is. Now, the previous speakers have spoken about the different bottlenecks that are there at the moment to that. And what we need to do is to ensure that the political commitments that are given, that are outlined in the programme for government, are actually delivered in reality when it comes to post the general election. And that's where we need to move to in relation to that. So one of the things I think that each of the people here and their colleagues could easily commit to, and that is to make sure that after the election, whether they're in government or opposition, that they pursue these targets, that they table parliamentary questions, that they quiz the incoming Minister for Health on that, on what practical steps are being taken to actually achieve this 6% target. Because a lot of the barriers here are not funding. They're in relation to, as Paul pointed out, GDPR and the interpretation of that here in Ireland, which is different to the way it's been interpreted in other EU countries. There's the issue of consent and ethics, which is being done in a piecemeal manner in different hospitals across the country, where there needs to be a uniform standard right across Ireland. And there's the opportunity with the Shared Ireland Fund that Micheál Martin as Taoiseach established, to use that fund to actually help the development of cross-border initiatives. And there's a huge willingness both in the north and here in the south to actually facilitate that happening. It's a win-win for everyone in relation to it, and probably will help to attract clinical researchers from Britain onto the island of Ireland as well, and accessing other EU funding. And what's really frustrating is that we are one of the global leaders in manufacturing some of these drugs, and yet our own citizens, the people living beside these pharmaceutical facilities and manufacturing facilities, can't get access to these drugs at an early stage of their development. And that's what we need to change. And hopefully after the election, you can actually deliver on that. So that's it, Eibhlin. I'll keep quiet at this stage. Thanks.
Thanks, Denis. And I mean, I knew everybody would appreciate hearing from you first, because you really captured the issues, and particularly the piece around there's no cost here, you know, and that's what we talked about earlier, but removing those bureaucratic barriers. I think there's an important point as well around the system, you know, and when you look at the National Cancer Strategy, you know, which really started back in 2006, and women in particular were dying. We didn't have centralised, as Denis really pointed out, those 8 key centres of excellence for cancer in the country. And that has been a game changer for care. I suppose this is the next step for us. If you look at a cancer strategy, the last 2 cancer strategies, there isn't really a line item for people in hospitals who work for trials. So, like, if you're on a clinical trial, the cost of the trial is the nurse, the doctor, the pharmacist, who's to make up the prescription the patient is on. The people in our office, and there's loads of them here from Cancer Trials Ireland, who are the auditors that go out and make sure the patients are safe on the trial. We write the protocol in the book. That's what we do. So it's all people. We need to invest in people, and we need to ring fence people. But even with that, we have some people in the system now, thanks to the Health Research Board, but there isn't a line item in the HSE budget for clinical trials or for cancer clinical trials. So just throwing that out there, that little missile before I start. I think the fairest thing to do now is to give each of you 2 minutes just to do your own contribution. Then we might open it up for some questions. So I'm going to start with Daithi. You were first in. here this morning, and you're very, very welcome.
First of all, I'm delighted to be here. This is hugely important. My name is Daithi Doolan. I'm a city councillor and a candidate in South Central, and I'm here representing Dave Cullinane, who's our spokesperson on health. Because I feel very strongly about this, so I was delighted to be given the opportunity to be here with other politicians. I think it shows the depth that people do have across all parties of this issue. I think I have to also commend Dave Cullinane, commended Denis Naughten's commitment to this. I said he's been a flag bearer for this, and I hope he continues to be a flag bearer when he's outside the Dáil. And he might find he might have even more influence outside the Dáil than you have in the Dáil.
He doesn't know yet, but he's our ambassador.
He doesn't know yet, but he doesn't know yet, but he's got a very bright future. With no mandates to worry about. But seriously, out in the doorsteps in my own constituency, South Central, yes, housing is number one. But healthcare is not too far behind. And what you also find is when somebody's concerned with their health, they sometimes don't have the luxury to worry about everything, including housing on hand, because it is literally life and death for themselves, their loved one, or someone who's close. And I think this needs to be central to any commitment to any party or parties coming into government. This is our health policy. It's very, very lengthy. I think it's well over 100 pages. So I don't expect people. People have read 120 pages, so it's very, very lengthy. And yes, there's a whole section, a whole chapter given over to cancer and cancer research. You'll be glad to know. And there's the commitment here is, and I'll read from it, one of the commitments is ring fence funding for access to clinical trials and ensure a continuous supply of new medicines. So that's in our policy. And also that there's a commitment to multi-annual funding. I think multi-annual funding is essential to the sustainability of any clinical trials, as it is in providing any other service coming from the state or semi-state. We need multi-annual funding. I find it, as somebody who works also in the community sector, I find it patronising and insulting to be expected to leap from one budget to another budget. Like you're only employed on an annual basis, as opposed to, hang on, I deserve, the people I work with and work for deserve more than 12-month budgets, leaping from crisis to crisis, and you're at a whim of somebody who's signing off on your checks every year. So that's our commitment. And also, having been involved in some of the development of this policy, just some of the statistics that jumped out at me, that Ireland, for a first world country, very rich economy, tripping over budget surpluses in the recent budget, that we are so far behind our EU neighbours, so far behind. And sometimes I feel, as an island nation, maybe it's part of our predisposition, we think, sure, this is how it's done everywhere in the world. It'd be great. And then you suddenly look at other EU countries, think, lads, we are far, far behind. And that's not some academic intellectual debate. We are so far behind, costs lives. And that's the reality of it. And I know for some people that's very emotional because what they've been through and the stories they've shared here today. But for me, as somebody who's trying to get elected to the Dáil, that's the reality for me. That's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about funding for the sake of funding. We're talking about research into life and death and prevention. And what we're committed to doing is the clinical trials, the full budget for the multi-annual budgets. If we're elected, there is a commitment in writing. The multi-annual budgets will be decided within 6 months of us taking office. But there is going to be money front-loaded in for this. I think it's about, say, about $500 million will be front-loaded in for all different trials, including clinical trials on cancer. And then within 6 months, people will know what the multi-annual budget will be so they can go ahead and plan into the future for people. I mean, one of the statistics that jumped out at me today was 50%. 50%. I'm thinking of me, my partner, my kids, people I love. I'm thinking, like, this is investing in all our futures. This should not be a political football. This should be a cross-party commitment to advancing the highest level. We should be the gold standard. Somebody said earlier on that I think it was yourself said we're only a small country.
Yeah.
Therefore, we're a rich small country. And you're right with the Good Friday Agreement. I remember being part of it. The imagination, the drive. We set the gold standard for peace processes with that. And I'm delighted here that cancer research was included in it. So why don't we use the same energy, cross-party commitment, cross-border commitment? We want rid of the border. but that's a whole other debate. But for the moment, let's work cross-border.
All borders.
All borders, yes.
Answer trials.
Absolutely. So, and that's something that can be done. I think the same level of imagination, commitment, cross-party commitment can actually set Ireland as the gold standard. Once you have the political commitment that there will be sustainable funding on a multi-annual basis, that's our commitment, and I'm delighted to sign the pledge here today. Shillelagh.
Shane, we'll move to Fianna Fáil next, and we'll let you set the stall.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Eibhlin, for having me today, and it's great to be on this panel with you this morning. I'm representing our Health Minister, Officer Stephen Donnelly, this morning. My name is Shane Moynihan. I'm a councillor currently in South Dublin County Council, and I'm a Fianna Fáil candidate for Dublin Midwest in the general election. Before I start, I want to thank Seamus and Miriam for, I think, injecting an urgency into this debate. That sometimes when you're looking at policy and you're reading manifestos, they can be quite dry, they can be very kind of objective, but I think listening to Seamus and Miriam's story brings very clearly home the need for urgency that is attached to this debate, and the fact that it needs to be put and kept on the political agenda, as former Deputy Naughten has pointed out and has done himself for such a long time as well. That is the first role that all of us as representatives need to do. Oftentimes, as politicians, we can get bogged down in the details of budget lines and so on, but the biggest power we have is by asking the question oftentimes, is by keeping it on the agenda and being direct with officials or whoever the individuals in government departments and agencies are in relation to this, asking them, what are you doing about this? And sometimes I think the silent speak and being a motivator in and of itself, but more importantly then, having an outcome that we can hold people to account. That being said, in our manifesto, we have set a very clear goal to double the number of patients on cancer trials in Ireland. That, in my view, should be the floor. It shouldn't be the ceiling of our ambition with regards to this. I think what strikes me from looking at this entire area is that we have excellence in manufacturing of the products that are used here. We have excellence in the research community of what's being used here, but we don't have the excellence in the administrative architecture there. And we look at the challenges like fragmentation, that in fairness, I think the Health Research Board is starting to address in terms of rolling out their research infrastructure, but we're not where we need to be yet, and we acknowledge that in our manifesto. When you look at the lack of consistency of approach across hospitals, that's a massive issue we have. And I think then in terms of the overall framework within which this is operating, there needs to be a deep think about what unnecessary obstacles are we creating for the rollout of further adoption and further implementation of cancer trials. And to put a purely economic point of view on this, if we are saying to the international pharmaceutical manufacturing community, Ireland is a centre of excellence, we have the skills available in this country to deliver top class products, we have the business environment, but we're also then telling them we're not where we need to be on the administrative infrastructure side, that is an issue for us. We have done that with tech. So we have shown the tech industry we are best in class when it comes to data protection. That's created some unnecessary or unforeseen externality on other sides of it, but we've done that well. So we have the skills, we have the administrative infrastructure, and we have the business environment. And the three of those things together make a very compelling offering for Ireland in terms of the tech piece. We need to now emulate that with regard to the cancer trials piece as well. And as many people have said, the issue here isn't funding. The issue here isn't the skills. The issue here is just putting that administrative infrastructure in place. And centralization is our friend here. And I think when you hear people say, I will get a different outcome if I live in Limerick, which is a large city, compared to if I live in Dublin, that should be an alarm bell for all of us in terms of the overall outcomes of what's being delivered. On the shared island piece, we have seen 1.2 million under the Northern Ireland US Cancer Fund over the previous period of time. I think it's an innovative and a very welcome suggestion to look at how we do that for the shared island initiative. That's something that obviously is very close to my party's heart, given our role in the Good Friday Agreement and given our role in setting up the shared island fund. And I think that is exactly the sort of practical cooperation that we need to be delivering and pioneering on this island as well. I think also the other piece, I would come back to the administrative stuff. So in a previous life, I worked in public services policy, which is about as dry as it sounds. And one of the things that you learn very quickly is that things like procurement professionals and things like project managers are actually really, really important in delivering the sort of outcomes you need. And this seems to be a blind spot for us in terms of how we're rolling this out. I would admit to you that if I am elected to the Dáil, this will be something I'll be putting in parliamentary questions on. I don't need for anyone to do that. I have seen, and even just hearing Seamus and Miriam's story today, that gives me that commitment that I want to do that. But I will also bring it to our minister that we need to look at how we have applied GDPR. We need to look at how we created unnecessary blockages for other pieces in our bid to be excellent at data protection. Are the things that we can do that doesn't inhibit that reputation, but allows us to embrace the cancer trial infrastructure that we need to develop. But also, I think we need to put pressure on the HSE and the Health Research Board to ensure that they deliver the administrative framework, that they get this fragmentation out of the system, and that they deliver a consistency of outcomes and approach for the people that are relying on it. So again, I'm looking forward to the questions and answers, but I think that's how we kind of see this debate developing.
Thanks, Julie. I'm trying my best to share, right, not get involved, but I will say, right, the Health Research Board funding pot hasn't changed. And it hasn't changed over the last number of years, and it's still going to be the same next year. Like, it's not good enough. And also the Health Research Board's job is not to provide nurses and doctors in hospitals to run clinical trials. Their job is to fund infrastructure and health clinical trials. So we're missing a trick, you know, and I would say to bring that back now, I'm not attacking anyone on this panel because you're all here and you're our friends now and you're going to be our friends forever. Because as I said earlier, Cancer Trials Ireland and the philosophy of this organisation is to work with people, not against them. Yeah. And everyone in this room that come from different and online are coming from very different perspectives. Yeah, you're friends for life. Emer, your turn.
Thank you, friend. Thank you all so much for hosting this. Thanks to everybody online for making the time, to everybody in the room for being here, but for also sharing your own personal stories and your own professional expertise. Miriam said it earlier, that patients die because they don't have access to clinical trials, and that when a patient dies, they don't have a voice. So I really appreciate all the work you're doing to give those people voices and to give a voice to people who don't even know at this point that they may be facing a cancer diagnosis in the near future or in the distant future. And just, I suppose, just to pay tribute to my colleague Denis Naughten, who I've worked very collaboratively with over the last number of years. And I know has been a champion in this area, but has also been a champion in the rare disease area as well, long COVID. I think you've taken a very special interest in health and in key health projects where I think we do need to really impact change. 80% was the statistic you gave us of the public want this, and I would think it's fairly okay to suggest or to imagine that 100% of politicians would want this, no matter what party you're from, no matter what area of the country you're from, that clinical trials hold so much hope for people and they can really change, and not just prognosis for individuals or for society at large. 5 things I've taken from today, I suppose first and foremost is that some things are working, that the National Cancer Strategy and that the new Oversight Group are working, are significant investments and are having an impact, but that we need better access. And by access, I don't just mean geographic access, but I absolutely do mean that. I also mean better access by having a moment and do this here. We need quicker access. I'm absolutely hearing that. And we need the data that is derived from clinical trials to be usable, to be user-friendly, to be used as quickly as possible. And I suppose we also, I think, need to look at this not just from a patient perspective, although that is the most important perspective, but to also look at it from a research perspective and a competitiveness perspective for Ireland. And I suppose all of those things really come down to bureaucracy and they come down to funding. So from a bureaucracy perspective, the GDPR legislation, I was really listening to that with huge interest, Paul. I'm shocked to hear how much of a hurdle GDPR is, and particularly when it comes to the data, when it comes to the administrative burden of being consistently and constantly asked to reconfirm something, but also when it comes to that data being usable and being available. You said it comes down to a signature of a minister. It does, but unfortunately there's a lot of work before that, whether that's getting to a ministerial order or a statutory instrument. And to get to that point, you would usually need buy-in from department officials. I'd be really keen to learn, have you gotten any of that? And if not, perhaps it's something I can work with you on to bring that to the attention of the department and of whoever the next minister may be. Because to me, that seems like something that should be should be very fixable and would have a very significant impact. And from a funding perspective, I hear what you're saying around the health research funding costs needed to be looked at. But I also heard with great interest Seamus say about just the survival on the grant funding and that cycle and the impact that has on talent, on retention and attraction of talent. Because if you don't have secure futures to be able to offer those professionals, you end up in a situation where they can't get mortgages. They may decide to change their career, and we're losing that talent as a result. So that's the perspective, I suppose, that I hadn't necessarily heard articulated, and I get that, and I will definitely bring that back. From a kind of, I suppose, a funding perspective, just to say on our Fine Gael manifesto, we have allocated 40 million additional funding towards the National Cancer Strategy. I have lots of information about in our document in relation to cancer, but I know it's the trials you're particularly interested in. And there has been a commitment in the manifesto to increase access and to increase the number of trials as well. And I suppose that's not just any particular party saying that, that's in our strategy. That's in the strategy that every party is signed up to. And that's why it's so important that whoever's in government, whoever's in opposition, keeps the pressure on to get to that 6%. I think when you look at things from a research, development and innovation perspective, I sat recently with the Taoiseach, the Taoiseach and many senior cabinet ministers around the National Competitiveness Summit. And one thing that we were talking about quite openly was the need for Ireland to invest in research, development and innovation. The need for us to become a leader in this, because this is a competitive area for not just Ireland, but also for Europe. We're now competing with many other global economies, whether that's China or elsewhere. And I think the very firm commitment was that we need to invest in infrastructure and we need to invest in research and innovation. And that commitment is now there from the National Competitiveness Council. And I think it's really important that that translates into funding in this area, because this is an area where we can show a huge competitiveness, a huge competitive edge globally, and an area where if we invest, we're going to save lives. So I can't think of any better way to be investing money than that.
Thank you very much. And I know all of you got involved in politics because you wanted to change the world. I really hope that's why you all got involved in politics. I certainly used to dip in and out of it for that reason. And this is something, if you nail your pin to the mast here for this, you will save lives. You're going to change lives, but you're going to save lives. And you know, one of the things, you know, when I hear about the talent piece and the piece that Seamus brought up, and you know, we're going from one grant to the next. People who work in cancer clinical trials in this country are entrepreneurial. They're constantly, they're flying by the seat of their pants from 1 year to the next. Will I get the grant in? Will I get the nurse in? Will I be able to cobble together the funding for that a clinical pharmacist to run this trial? And they do it out of sheer passion for the patient in the clinic. They're not doing it because it's part of their performance-related package at the end of the year with their manager in the hospital. And there's a beauty about that, but it's not sustainable, you know. And to be honest, there's a predominant number of people from one gender involved in clinical trials, and there's an unfairness around that as well, around respect for people who work in the system. I think Daithi, you raised that as well, you know. So I do think we need to really create professionalism around clinical trials in this country in cancer, for patients, because that's what's driving us all. We could talk all day about the savings you will make in your budget if you run clinical trials. We could talk all day about the fact that you don't pay for drugs if you've run a clinical trial, that there's no cost to the patient if they recruit onto a study, that the staff time and the cost time towards people in the clinic is covered by the sponsor if it's a pharmaceutical trial. We could give you loads of stats on that. But our driver here is the patient. And I saw Sinead Brennan, I don't know if she's still online, Sinead Brennan and Jerry is as well. Radiation oncology is not really about drugs at all. It's about radiation. And that's something we're able to do today. And we have a fantastic all-island study that we're opening at the moment with our friends at Belfast and the Republic. It's going to mean patients only visit the clinic twice instead of 5 times for radiation therapy treatment. From a patient perspective, that's wonderful, right? You only have to go twice. From a cost perspective, Jerry, do you want to talk about it? I don't see Sinead there at all.
Yes, so radiation, our machines are sitting here. Obviously, we need to constantly update those machines, but they sit there anyway, and the cost is only the staffing time. But if we can reduce the number of visits, one, it's brilliant for patients. is also really good because we can treat more patients, the same staff, the same number of machines. And the second thing, we actually know that sometimes when we design the treatment with fewer visits, it's actually not just as effective, but it actually has less side effects. So there's a lot of gains all around the piece, but we need to improve that in cancer trials. And one thing about cancer trials is, as mentioned earlier, when we bring a cancer trial, and particularly in areas such as radiation oncology, we actually do a lot of what's called quality assurance. So we make sure our health service is safe, that the treatments we give routinely to patients every day are gold standard by an international standard. That means that we deliver world-class care here in Ireland, in our routine care, as well as our trials. So trials are very much integral to what we do, but radiation trials are very innovative. We probably don't invest enough of those in many ways because it falls off the kind of radar of others such as pharmaceutical companies and so forth. We're also very interested actually in the combination of drugs and radiation. So we know some of the new drugs such as immunotherapy, which has been game changing the treatment of cancer. It led to cures where cures were not possible. We also combining with treatments such as radiation actually improves those drugs. A lot of pharmaceutical companies are very interested in us running those trials here now, but we need the infrastructure. We need to cut back the red tape, and we need to get you to support us in the multi-year funding. That's what my plea would be to you. But of other final pleas, thank you so much for your interest.
So there might be, so I don't know if there's some questions online, but I'm looking at you, Krista, in the room. Right, because Krista and I were at it. Krista's working for the Irish Cancer Society. We'll talk about the importance of genetics and genomics, maybe. Because we were at an event last week with Lynch syndrome, and I think it might be relevant today.
Lynch syndrome BRCA. Well, I have the BRCA1 gene alteration. My grandmother passed away of ovarian cancer, and my mother also passed away of ovarian cancer. Now, lucky enough, my mum did partake in a clinical trial, and because of her BRCA2 trial, people with high grade serious ovarian cancer are now routinely tested for BRCA1, which means they have better tailored treatment options. Now, on paper, it's amazing and it does save lives, but the reality is, we don't have a lab over here that gets tested. So that adds, like, what could take only a couple of weeks, it takes like minimum of 12 weeks from when you get your test to when you get your results. That is not great. People with this type of ovarian cancer, it's particularly aggressive, do not have that time to be waiting. So, that's just one issue. Like we need to have more. I'm also I'm on the PPI and the comms group of the National Genomics Acceleration Strategy. They don't know whether they're getting their funding next year. They don't have a budget. They don't have a funding. There's no commitment. They have a plan. They have, but they don't have anything else, and that is off the back of the National Cancer Strategy. So it's one thing to say you guys are going to fund the National Cancer Strategy, but what about all the other things that came out of the National Cancer Strategy? Where are they? Like, there seems to be like is give so much, but where's the follow-up? Where's the commitment? Who's checking in on this? Who's seeing where the funding is going? Who's kind of keeping an eye on this? Because can't grow without this kind of investment.
And it's saving lives, Chris.
Saving lives.
Because if you if you have a tumor,
yeah,
you need to decide what's in it. And will this drug, I'm going to break it down, will this drug match what's in that tumor? We don't have the capability in this country we should have. And when Seamus, I think Seamus wants to come in. Maybe
yeah. So there were a couple of things online, and I know there's going to be a report about this, but I think it's important to just, while we're in the moment, to just emphasize the role of protected time, when posts are created, that there is protected time for research as part of them. Was also questions online about the removal of VAT from research, which would allow funding to be maximised, and that would be a very straightforward legislative thing. And also the representative from NREC, the National Research Ethics Committee, also was highlighted. I think it's important to say that when we want to do something, we can really do something. So the National Research Ethics Committee was set up because, a bit like the data protection, we had ethics committees everywhere. And now we have one, and it's hugely successful. It's resourced, it works well. Nobody talks about ethics anymore because you don't talk about the thing that works. But we know that if we focus, the organizations of the state around a thing, that it can work. And I think the other thing is that, you know, we're after the pandemic, which is a terrible time for patients and families and everything like that. But the pandemic showed that when we want things to work, they can work quickly. And I think that we need that same level of energy now. And you know, and it may be that the election could serve as a circuit breaker on inertia, and that would re-energize things, and we could start afresh with sweeping away the undergrowth and getting things moving.
I think Denis wants to come in, I guess, on genomics. Denis, is it?
Yes, just very briefly, Eibhlin, I know we're coming near the end of time, but just 3 quick points. The first one is that, look, all 3 of the parties, either in their health policies or in their manifestos, are have committed to increasing the number of clinical cancer trials. The difficulty is that the cancer strategy sets out a very clear target of 6%. And what we need to do is to hit that target and go beyond that. And there needs to be a clear program to achieve that. And look, you're not going to get that level of detail in a manifesto, but it is important that as part of the discussions on the program for government and the delivery subsequent to that, that those targets are achieved and superseded. Just on the genomics, and I welcome the fact now that the HSE has gone and tendered for a centralised genomics laboratory here in Ireland. I think that's very positive. But just on the very practical aspect of it, down the road from where everyone is sitting at the moment, St James's Hospital is effectively the centre in Ireland presently for genomics, particularly in relation to adults. Today, there are 2,500 people, mainly women, waiting for cancer tests, including cancer tests for breast cancer screening. They're waiting at least 18 months to access a test that can be carried out in a few days and the results turned around. Part of that bottleneck is the fact that we only have 6 genomics counsellors in St James's Hospital, where we need to meet the international standard at least 20. And the reality is that we have more genetic and inherited diseases in Ireland, so we should have more staff, counselling staff available so that we can access these screening services. There's an array of them out there, but we can't access them without accessing the counselling first.
I feel like thank you, Denis. You really are a member of the team. You know, and I think in terms of the genetics piece, you know, that's about, Krista, it's about prevention. Yeah. You know, if you've got a hereditary genetics and you know about it, you can prevent cancers. And there's 2,500 people waiting to know about that, James, at the moment. And why is it taking so long? And I think we are going to try and do a better job at explaining it, because very often it's very hard to get this message across. But that's only in James's. This is right across the country. Ireland was and potentially still is a genetic isolate. That's why we have a higher prevalence of rare diseases, a higher prevalence of genetic conditions in our population. That's unique to us. There's also richness in that. Is there anything in your final words that you would like to say from what you've heard? Maybe Daithi.
I suppose the things that jump out at me was actually something you said
a
few seconds ago, and I think Denis confirmed it. The issue of gender can't be removed. Like 2,500 people waiting for tests. That's shocking. Mostly women.
Absolutely.
And I think in an era of enlightenment, that's unacceptable. That's an underlining malaise preventing healthcare. And I do feel that gender does play a very serious, or puts an obstacle in the way for healthcare. And I think we just need to be clear about that. Men have their own issues around healthcare and access to it. But I think when it's almost structurally put in place, I think that we need to dismantle that. I think we all need to give a commitment to dismantling that.
Men don't do the test, they don't want
to. They don't do the test. With very different obstacles put in place. One is we need to learn, and the other is the systems need to learn around the gender. So what I would say is that we are committed to a very holistic approach to a cancer strategy that is inclusive of patient and doctor. That we will have the doctors involved in developing and delivering the strategy. They want a veto, they want a preferential treatment, but it'll certainly be locked into the process. And my final point would be that GDPR has a role, it must have a role, but again, it can't smother progress or bureaucracy. I see it all the time in my work. As a daytime job, I work in addiction services, and GDPR, people use that. They use the magic word GDPR, and thus you won't move any further. I'm a city councillor, and like Shane, you deal with the housing issues. GDPR prevents me ringing the local authority on behalf of somebody. Ridiculous. I need to get written consent, and somebody's in a sleeping bag on the canal. That is absolutely unacceptable. GDPR is written and promoted by people who never face those decisions. And I think that we need to go in there, all of us, with a flamethrower and burn away some of the GDPR. Because it's ridiculous.
You've got someone to go with you.
Under the table. But seriously, I think GDPR, we need to take that on board because it's preventing us. So a holistic approach, patient-centric, with doctors and clinicians involvement in it, multi-annual budget, and commitment in our policy to ring-fence funding on a multi-annual basis for clinical research. And then by thank you so much for this. It's very inspiring and heartening to be in a room of people who are committed to keeping people alive in research. Thank you so much. Thanks for your input.
We're about to be kicked out, so we're going to Shane.
Very quickly, so 3 final points I make is, first I would say that on genetic genomic medicine, we've made a commitment to increase funding in our manifesto. The fact that parties are now making those sort of commitments in their manifestos is instructive of where the public debate is moving. That's a positive. The second, it comes back to be fragmentation. We need to put the foundational administrative building blocks in place to get rid of a lot of this mismatch. Daithi's right, GDPR is used as a tool to beat elected reps over the head when it comes to this sort of stuff. So is inconsistency of standards. Well, we do it differently in Galway. Oh, we do it differently in Donegal. That's not how we do it here, Councillor. So that is something that we need to get a handle on, and centralisation is our friend there. And thirdly, I would say is your role is now never more important. You need to keep this on the political agenda. You need to educate, and you need to inject that sense of urgency that you've injected in this discussion here today. That I think can be missing sometimes from a lot of discussion about health policy, which can become desensitized, because we know we face a lot of challenges in health at the moment. We're dealing with a lot of them. We do face challenges in health. We need to remove that desensitization, and for relatively low-hanging fruit, which is what I think cancer trials are in terms of improving outcomes, you have a really important role there to play in terms of educating the public representative class about how best to advance this agenda. But again, like Daithi, thank you very much for having me today.
Yeah, thank you so much. Listen, I think this is really useful. It's an important conversation to have. It's great to have so many different political parties represented here. Seamus, you talked about energy and the same level of energy being looked up from COVID. I'm very proud to have as my leader Simon Harris, who's certainly bringing a lot of energy to his current role as Taoiseach, and I think had served as a very good Minister for Health, and I hope that this is something that will be high on his agenda. It's very focused in our manifesto. This is something we are committed to. We want more clinical trials places available. We want access increased, and we want more investment. It's quite interesting, actually, the most recent part of the conversation has been around specialised services and how important those specialised services are from an investment perspective. I'm absolutely happy to talk to Paul afterwards as well, because I do think from a statutory and from perspective, if there's anything we can do around this GDPR barrier, that's something I would like to take on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Love to keep going, but you're an RCSI and there's a PhD interview going on next.
Okay.
But I will say there's some other representatives in the room from the pharma sector who I'm sure would love to catch you in the corridor afterwards and have a conversation about that. But today has been, we've set the bar. You're our friends now.
Yeah.
We're going to keep in contact, and we're going to have an outcome report from this. And I hope to meet you all, whether you're in government or in opposition, and wish you all the very best in your campaigns over the next 2 weeks. And don't forget to change the world and save lives in cancer. Thank you.
Thank you very much.